Yeah, I've been at Microsoft 2.5 years, and I actually spent the first 18 months of that in lockdown. It's been very weird. I've only been out and about again over the last over the last year. So I'm going to be sharing with you a lot of information, a lot of stats, what's going on, and it's really about providing context. Because I'm going to be sharing some numbers with you, and those numbers look quite big. But I want you to remember these are point-in-time numbers. So whatever numbers I share with you, that we have surpassed that, and we're going to keep surpassing that as well. So I want you to kind of think about the context of what I'm talking about. But I also want you to think about something else as well, which is hyperscale. And it's really the kind of the value, the benefit that you get when you're dealing with Microsoft. And obviously Microsoft is 47 years old, can you believe it, this year? So in the realm of big tech, we're kind of like not just big tech, we're kind of granddaddy of tech as well. I think again, it's when we think about context and where we are, where we've been in the last 3 years, we had not one major event, not two, but three. So obviously we started with a global pandemic 3 years ago. And we saw a mass acceleration to the cloud. So although there are many companies already on that journey to the cloud, they've accelerated and accelerated at a speed we have never really experienced before. We started to see a lot of companies really relaxing their policies when it comes to bring your own device. They're changing their business models. They're embracing IoT, OT, digitalization, all of these things combined. The second major event that we had at the end of 2020 was the biggest cyber attack we've ever seen by a nation-state actor, and that's SolarWinds. Now, we genuinely believe SolarWinds is the most sophisticated attack we have ever seen. And it's kind of a sign of the times that the nation-state actors are coming out from behind the scenes, and they don't really care how they're being seen or how they're acting. That brings us to the third event, which is the one that we're seeing right now, which is the war in Ukraine. And all of these things combined just mean that there's been so much change, but the attackers have been absolutely relentless during that period. And it's really made us having to think about our cybersecurity. What do we do today? What do we do in the future? And as I said, I'm going to be sharing some numbers with you. And again, when I think about context, so where we are right now, when we think about Microsoft and we kind of think of that hyperscale of Microsoft, so we have 220 data centers, 17 of those we opened in the last 2 years in Europe. We have 175,000 miles of fiber and subsea cables, which means we actually have one of the biggest wide area networks in the world. So none of those data centers are actually connected over the internet. They're all point-to-point networks. So on top of that, we have 200,000 people. Now again, when I talk about context, 25% of those, so 50,000 people, have joined in the last 2 years. So when I talk about Microsoft is 47 years old and 50,000 people have joined in the last 2 years alone, you can start to see the context and scale that I'm talking about. And we have currently over 8,000 open positions. So these are data scientists, they're analysts, they're coders, they're engineers, they're AI specialists, they are gamers, they are all of these things, because we're having to really kind of think about where the world is going. When we think about all of that technology, every single day we collect, process and analyze over 43 trillion telemetry signals. Now again, put that into perspective. If I roll the clock back 2.5 years ago, that was 6.5 trillion. So we are 7 times the number of telemetry signals that we were 2.5 years ago. So how do you make sense of 43 trillion telemetry signals? And again, if I want to give you another number, that's approximately 360 petabytes every single day of data. About 10% of our cloud is dedicated to telemetry data. So we utilize huge amounts of machine learning, data analytics. We have about 8,500 people at the moment working in cybersecurity. So I said these are a mix of data scientists, they're researchers, they're analysts, and it's context again that we're trying to make sense. What's new, what's different, how the attackers are evolving. Now with all of that information, we turn that into threat intelligence and we turn it into actual intelligence. Now all of that kind of feeds its way back into all of the technology that we're talking about today. And it's that context that I'm going to be talking about. As I said, I'm going to be giving you some numbers, but I wanted to kind of just start with just kind of putting it out there, where we are, where we've come from, and kind of arguably where we're going. So when we think about just some of the core trends, and I am going to be speaking around some of these as well, and I'm going to kind of give you some insights, particularly with regards to some of the threat actors, some of the nation state actors. Kind of some of those key trends that we're starting to see is in destructive malware. We've seen a revival of hacktivism, particularly with Anonymous and other gangs like that. We've seen huge targeting of critical infrastructure, SCADA systems, industrial control systems, huge supply chain attacks. I mentioned about SolarWinds, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. So we've sort of seen a lot of companies are utilizing open source software. And that's really a challenge for many companies when they're thinking about just the relationships that they have with multiple third parties and how intricate those relationships are. So we've sort of seen a lot of companies are rethinking their business models. They're trying to get online, they're thinking about their consumers. So we've seen this kind of huge surge in mobile applications and services. And really the core. Now I think something to remember, although the attackers have been absolutely relentless, and I mean relentless, we said surely in the middle of a pandemic you wouldn't hit a hospital. They did, and they've gone for it big time. So this is kind of, the attackers haven't gone away, but I think one thing to be mindful of is up to the attackers to evolve first, not us. So they're always on the back foot. So every time we bring out new technology, we bring out new sensors, we bring out new detections, that means they have to evolve their tactics and their techniques. That means that they also have to be able to keep thinking about their return on investment. What is going to give me the best return for my money or for my effort? And arguably, when they start to learn our defenses, they understand technology, they understand how automation, the machine learning, all of these things that we're investing in is coming to fruition. They're going backwards, and they're going backwards into specifically in social engineering. And I'm going to be talking about some of that. But I said I was going to share with you some numbers, and I think these numbers are quite, I said they're big, but again, put it in context. This probably some of these numbers were maybe from a few weeks ago, maybe even some months ago when they were first kind of put together. So whatever number I give you, you think about it being surpassed. So what I'm going to share with you is just some insights in terms of where we are, in terms of kind of mapping the cyber timeline. And I'm going to be talking about what happens every minute of every day. And I'm going to start particularly with the expanding attack surface. Now, I think when you kind of look at, as I said, that mass acceleration to the cloud, lots of companies rethinking their business models. Now, you kind of think about if you introduce 80,000 new hosts every minute. So these can be resources in the cloud, they can be endpoints, they can be multiple things. Now, you're kind of assuming every single one of those has been configured correctly. We know that's not the case, and I'm going to be talking about that. So every single one of those introduces another entry into the environment. We sort of seen a mass acceleration to IoT smart technology. So we're introducing over 7,000 new IoT devices every minute, 150 domains, new SSL certificates, and new mobile applications. So the attack surface is not just growing exponentially, it's growing every single minute of every single day. Now, as I sort of said, you can just keep adding numbers, keep plussing all of the numbers on top. So then let's think about the volume of attacks every single minute. Now, the vast majority of coming are password attacks. Now, actual fact, you've probably heard some stats from Microsoft that 80% of all cyber attacks start with some kind of credential theft. Now this is why we are dedicating day 2 tomorrow to identity, because identity is absolutely core to everything, and I'm going to explain why, and that's going to be really kind of evident over the course of the next 2 days. So one of the most attacked entities that may actually surprise you, and it's month on month, is education. And I think people are like, well, oh really? Not financial services, not manufacturing, not critical infrastructure. No, it's schools. And the reason why is again, it's kind of come down to the pandemic. So the attackers are looking for the low-hanging fruit. And with the schools in particular going online, children are utilising their parents' devices, they might be utilising a device they've borrowed, they don't have the same level of security. So they are introducing malware, they're collecting credentials, and they're collecting those credentials to see how many other doors does it unlock. Particularly if you're thinking about children, schools, they're not going to have the same level of security, password controls, and all of these things. So they hit education, they gather up as many credentials as possible, and then they go up the food chain, if you like. So they go to retail, they start opening up all the doors. And that's why we're sort of seeing over 35,000 password attacks per minute. And when we think about IoT devices, again, I think historically we're thinking about how they configured right. A lot of the IoT devices might come with a standard password. How many people actually change the password? So when we're thinking about, again, how many doors does a password open, if it still says admin on it, and you'll be surprised actually how many IoT devices actually have admin, no password, password 123, you can kind of see why it's so easy to do IoT-based attacks. So they're kind of like, it's not DDoS attacks, phishing attacks. Now, phishing attacks, you're probably thinking that sounds quite low if 80% of all attacks start with some kind of credential theft. So I just caveat that when we talk about a phishing attack, that's an attack that's attacking an entity, if you like. So it's one attack, but that might be across multiple endpoints, multiple mailboxes. So if we have to talk about the mailboxes, that would go up even higher. So again, to put it into perspective, just with regards to the type of attacks that Microsoft is blocking. So we talked about Microsoft technology, and we've been heavily investing in extended detection and response. So our role is to look at the visibility end to end. Where are those attacks coming from, and how do we automatically block them? So we have over 60,000 email threats being blocked every single minute. Now this is not just phishing emails, this is safe. This is when you think about the links that you might have, attachments, spoof domains, all of the things that you're scanning for across emails. So that's 70,000. Identity threats, again, is kind of core up there with regards to the type of things that we're blocking every single minute. Brute force attacks that Azure AD is detecting. So again, this is these password sprays. And then we still have malware. Now, actually, interesting thing, ultimately, malware is on the decrease overall, particularly when we're thinking about phishing attacks and phishing emails. So although we normally kind of sort of say there's two things, either the attackers are trying to utilize fake domains, they're trying to collect credentials, or they're trying to get you to launch an attachment, and that attachment may have some malware or may have some things in it. Because of the type of technologies that we have, because we're scanning attachments, because we can detonate attachments in a safe environment, it's actually harder to get malware into the environment through phishing attacks. So they need the malware to come from different areas, from different things. So though malware is lower, it's not gone away, it's just the fact that it's so much easier to get the user or get the person to willingly give up their own credentials. And again, I'm going to kind of come back to how they're evolving some of those tactics. And I just want to kind of look at the cost, the overall cost, again, per minute. So we're up to $1.1 million per minute overall in cybercrime. I think the estimate is by 2025, we're going to be at 8 trillion impact. And the actual overall financial impact globally is actually bigger than the drug trade, if you believe it or not. An actual fact, I was talking to somebody from the National Crime Agency just a couple of weeks ago, And they gave me some stats, which I found quite extraordinary. And they actually said fraud is now the most dominant crime in the UK. It makes up 45% of all crime. And I find that quite extraordinary. So a couple of years ago, that was 25%. And the reason why that number is so high is because of the cybercrime. And the real worry is that people don't know who they're dealing with, particularly when we're thinking about organised crime, ransomware. These are dangerous people. They are not just opportunists. These are people who have managed to find out that actually cybercrime pays, and it arguably pays very well. So we look at ransomware in particular. So we got $38,000 a minute. Now, interestingly, this is not the extortion demands. This is the overall impact. So if you have encrypted networks, exfiltration of data, you've got people in your network, you have to evict the attacker, you need to recover, potentially you're down for days, weeks, whatever the case may be. So the actual damage from all of that is quite substantial. But the one I really want you to take notice of is business email compromise, because that actually is the most impacting financial crime of all. Now, you might not believe it, you might have thought ransomware was there, but actually, as I said, it's a ransomware damage, not the actual amount of money that they're actually getting. So the cost of business email compromise makes up 40% of all financial crime, and that number is on the rise quite substantially. And then we're starting to see cryptocurrency scams, particularly with regards to how do they get money, how do they launder money. So cryptocurrency, getting access to wallets is kind of core into all of that. Now, I want to share with you some kind of insights. We talk about ransomware a lot, so where's the kind of the big change in ransomware? Well, ransomware is nothing new. It's been around for 10 years. But the really trajectory change is in the big game ransomware. So it's highly targeted and very much, they take their time in terms of being able to understand and learn about their target. So this is not just getting access, it's not about exfiltration of data, it's really understanding the environment that they're in, how they can manipulate people to pay a ransom and how much ransom. Now, where we're starting to see it flipping more so, not just in the IT environment, but we talked about them getting access into critical infrastructure, particularly into the OT environment. Now, the worry here is they don't understand OT like they do IT. This means that they're either going to just start turning things on and off, seeing what happens. Potentially there's a major accident, there's a major thing that's going to happen. Or if they really want to know what's going on and how they can cause as much collateral damage as possible or get someone to pay a really big ransom, they need an insider. And I think that's really kind of where we're seeing that coming from. Again, that social engineering, understanding someone who's either willingly going to give up their credential or willingly going to give me some information. Now, this is a real concern of the National Cybersecurity Centre. Earlier this year, they issued their national strategy. It's the first time in 5 years that they've actually published it. And it's the first time in 5 years since National Cybersecurity Centre was actually formed. And they believe ransomware in particular is one of the most dominant threats in the UK. Particularly, as we sort of said, with the harm, the damage, the willingness of some of these attackers to go that one step further. And I talked about not disruption, but destruction as well. And 80% of all of those ransomware attacks, remember, they need to get onto the network first, which is where the credential compromise comes from. Once they're in, this is where the difference happens, and it really comes down to how far you can detect what are they doing, the changes that they're making, and how you're able to react to that. And a lot of that comes down to misconfiguration errors, and I'm going to talk around some of those things in particular. we have seen a huge rise in access brokers. So these are just people, I mean, if you think about from the attacker's perspective, and I talked about that return on investment, why would I waste my time trying to break into someone's network, knowing what I know about the technology they probably have invested in? Why would I build phishing campaigns when I can get someone to do it on my behalf? And this is the real crux of the problem. Anything and everything can be sold, can be monetized. Now, there's a kind of a misconception that attackers are after financial data. The truth is they're after all and any data. And that can be sold, it can be divvied up. Now, in terms of buying credentials on the dark web, they are prorated, believe it or not. So if I just want to have 1,000 email addresses for company A, because I want to have a phishing campaign. Now those credentials are very low value because I don't necessarily know how many doors they're going to open. I just know they're an email address, there's a password attached to it. Probably go for less than $1. The further up I go, so potentially I then have to go to another access broker or another service, another syndicate, because the real value in the money is having a privileged admin. And having a privileged admin which has been proven to work and proven to open. So you can kind of see like a lot of these things are being bought and sold on the dark web just as you would go into a normal supermarket. You do not have to be a genius. You don't even have to be an IT professional because they're going to give you kits. There's ransomware kits, there's scripting, there's malware. There's things you can just do yourself, you can do it as a group. And that's the kind of the reality when we're thinking about access brokers and what they're doing. Now, kind of looking at some of the evolving techniques, and I talked about social engineering in particular. Now, we are actively tracking about 250 different threat actors. Some of those are nation-state actors, I'll come on to that. Some of the ransomware operators, and then we have a subgroup that we call dev groups, the development groups. And this is one of them, Lapsus. And I'm just going to, you'll probably be familiar with them. They've been in and out the news quite a lot, actually, lately. But I think some of their tactics are quite interesting, and they don't fit what you would expect for a cyber criminal. So when we think about cyber criminals, we're probably thinking about these organised crime gangs. We're thinking about they're coming from Eastern Europe. We certainly don't expect it to be a teenager in Oxford. So this is the kind of that reality, that kind of that misconception of what we think an attacker actually is and how they're evolving. Now, we've been actively tracking this group, so probably since the beginning of this year. And you'll see that there's the Dev 0537. So when we have a new group or someone that we can't 100% attribute to, we give them this code. So it's a dev and then 4 numbers. And we're actively tracking probably over 100 of those at any one time. So sometimes these are new campaigns. They're existing threat actors, but they're having to evolve their tactics in particular. So this particular group, they have been active across the UK, they've been active in Brazil and other countries. But I'm not expecting you to kind of read all of this, but I just want to kind of give you some insights about what they're doing. And I think the most blazing thing they've done is actually just put out adverts on the internet and buying credentials. And they have even put out a list of all the credentials that they want and which companies they want. Now, some of these are different things. I want to buy your credentials, I want to buy an MFA bypass, or I'm going to click a link, I'm going to send you some software. All you have to do is download it, walk away. So this is remote access software. So they are spending a huge amount of time understanding their victims. And I don't mean a victim as in the company. I'm talking about the people they are targeting from a social engineering perspective. They are taking their time to get access into someone's personal account, their Facebook, their social media, their LinkedIn, whatever they are. And it's to understand that individual. And what they're trying to do is actually trying to understand who they are, potentially what their security questions are. So if I want to ring up a help desk and say, I forgot my password, I might need to have some questions, some security questions. And so they're going into social media accounts to find out what they are. Now the interesting thing again, with regards to then just how much they're targeting some of these people, is what they're trying to get access to is someone with a privileged account. Now I think again, when we talk about privileged accounts, we need to be mindful of the fact we are not just talking about IT people with admin access. We're also looking at users who have privileged access. So these could be people in seniority, it can be people with the ability to sign off transactions. So you need to kind of think broader with regards to what they're doing. Now they've been quite brazen. They've just rang the help desk, pretended to be a user to try to get that password changed with some of the questions. Now obviously the help desk is going to ask them what that question is. So it might be, what's the name of your first pet? Was that on your Facebook? I need to go and have a look. So they obviously know the questions that you're going to ask. Some of them they'll find. Now the interesting thing, again, in terms of how we actually educate our help desk people with regards to what they should be looking out for. Now the other thing, as I sort of said, these are teenagers from Oxford. So they're ringing the help desk with a very nice, very polite English accent. So when we're thinking about who are cyber criminals, where they're coming from, if you think they're Eastern European, if you think they're going to have a foreign accent, you need to make sure that people understand it's any accent, and they're going to ask any question. Now I think that, again, when I think about some of the real cheekiness of some of the attackers, so let's say they've been able to get privileged access, they were able to change a password. And now dependent on how you've configured some of your technology, and I'm going to hazard a guess that you might have a global admin, maybe for M365 or others, and that global admin gives you access to everything. Now, we will keep telling you again, with regards to segregate those admins, make sure that we're restricting what those admins can do. But let's say for argument's sake, they have got access to your global admin. They start to then delete things in your environment. So they're going to delete resources, they're going to start deleting mailboxes, they might start moving the email in and out of the company. The sole reason for doing this is not just to cause as much damage as possible, but to trigger your crisis management response. Now, because they're in your network and because they're watching what you're doing, they're actually on your crisis management call. So again, when we think about assumed compromise, how far have they exfiltrated into your environment? So if they're in Office, they're probably in Teams, they're probably on your email, they're probably watching everything that you're doing. So from an incident response perspective, they're watching your every move. So if they've given you a ransomware demand and you've been very, very clear with your strategy, we are not paying no matter what they do, they're listening to that, so they're going to plan their next move. Now the next move might be to start deleting your backups, and if you're really, really adamant that you're not going to pay, they're just going to release your data anyway. So we have seen instances where they haven't even bothered to try and extort the victim. They've actually just put the data straight out there. Now the reason why they've done this is to make a name for themselves. Because they want notoriety. They are a relatively new threat actor, so they want to make sure their name is published here, there and everywhere. So it's almost a case of, I can do it if I want to, I'm in your network, I may extort you, I may not extort you, but I'm certainly watching you, and I'm certainly watching every move and what you do next. So what do we learn from that really, is the fact that they are everywhere, and we have just sort of seen Uber in particular. They have published on their own website that you can go to and have a look yourself, how Uber was actually targeted by lapsus. And you'll see a common thread here with regards to the attacker socially engineered one of the people in the company. They got access to their social media account. From there, they were able to get access to their corporate account. And then the interesting thing then is that it's an MFA bypass. Now, what we're kind of sort of seeing is MFA spamming of accounts and trying to target very different people. Now, the interesting thing, and which I'll come on to, is not MFA is not always built the same. And when even we have someone, an MFA prompt, sometimes people just say yes on the very, very fast prompt they get. So it doesn't even have to be spamming a lot of the time. But that, as soon as they say yes, that means they've got access into the environment potentially. So kind of where do we go? What are the things that, particularly from lapsus and some of the things that they're doing, things to be mindful of is really increasing the awareness of social engineering attacks, reviewing help desk procedures. It's particularly for privileged accounts. How do they actually change their password? What are the type of questions that you're asking of people? Monitoring your incident and crisis management. So if we assume compromise and if you assume someone's in your network, you need a complete hands off the environment. And that might mean standing up additional telephony or crisis management calls in different environments. But you should assume you are actively have someone in your network. And until you have actually evicted that attacker, they're going to still stay in your network. Now, we talked about strengthening MFA implementation. Now, not all MFA is built the same. And this is why you get this MFA spamming going on. So unless the MFA requires you to actually have some kind of interaction, you're going to get it. People are going to fall foul to a lot of these things. So with Microsoft, we have the Authenticator app that you might be familiar with, which actually requires someone to match a number that they receive on their mobile device with what's on their screen. We've also introduced a map, so you can actually see where the login is coming from. So the most important thing is there has to be some kind of interaction going on with that user and that device. But we also want to make sure we've got trusted and healthy endpoints, and we're really reviewing particularly some of that VPN access as well. Now, I talked about nation-state actors and the war in Ukraine in particular, and where we are right now with the particular, some of the threats that we're sort of seeing there. Now, I mentioned that Microsoft has been actively tracking a number of different threat actors. And they're kind of like the big four, come from Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. Now, if you look on the Russia side, Nobelium, so they're the threat actor behind SolarWinds. And on the China side, you've got Hafnium. They were the threat actor behind the Exchange server attack against Microsoft a couple of years ago. I'm going to focus on Russia in particular. Now, we're only actually showing a handful of the threat actors there, and there's probably about 80. Microsoft has to be very careful when it comes to attribution because we're still a commercial entity and these are nation-state actors. So we name them after elements on the periodic table. And like I say, I'm going to focus on Russia in particular and the war in Ukraine. Now, what we kind of identified really, that Russia have always used Ukraine as a training ground. They understand the infrastructure very, very well. And we've been working with Ukraine for a number of years, as in a number of different countries. So when the Ukrainian government saw the Russian troops amassing on the borders, so for the first couple of months before the actual invasion, they got very concerned with regards to how they were going to protect their data, how they were going to protect their services. And a realization that all of their data was on-premise is kind of what we see with a lot of public sector and a lot of government. And so those weeks and months leading up to the actual attack, Microsoft had to step in and help the Ukrainian government, not just move it to the cloud, but move it out of the country. completely to keep it out of harm's way from the Russia. Now, what we've kind of seen is the first day of the invasion was the 24th of February, and Russia actually launched multiple missiles from land, air, and sea across multiple Ukrainian cities. But it actually was not the start of the war. The start of the war happened the day before, on the 23rd of February. And Russia actually launched 300 simultaneous cyber attacks. And it was designed to try and knock out as much of the Ukrainian government, infrastructure, comms, digital, all of those things, so that by the time they launched the missiles, the ground-to-air missiles, they were going to try and cripple Ukraine as much as possible, and they thought the war was going to end very quickly. Now, that malware we denoted as a foxblade, and it was designed particularly to destruct as much as the environment, or wipe the environment as much as possible. Now, the threat actor behind that we have now called that Iridium, and it's one of the nation states, it's one of the Russian intelligence agencies. Iridium is also the same threat actor behind NotPetya that was launched a few years ago. Now, they learnt some lessons because NotPetya, when they launched that, managed to escape into the wild, and it kind of went all over the world. With this one in particular, they have managed to confine it. They've managed to confine it into Ukraine itself. Now, that could be a sign of the times, that they're trying to make sure that it doesn't kind of escape what's going on. And I want to just kind of show you with regards to this kind of hybrid war that we're sort of seeing and some of the activity. Now, I mentioned about the destructive malware. So they started the destructive and wiper malware as early as January. But they really went to town on that 21st of February. And they thought it was going to be a shock and awe, it was going to be over and done with very, very quickly. They hadn't obviously taken into consideration that a lot of the Ukrainian infrastructure and data had already been moved. And there's a lot of support, not just from military and other countries that are providing that cover for Ukraine. The next kind of thing that the Russian did, they tried to deface a number of the Ukrainian government websites, and they tried to do that very early on in the conflict as well. And this is really aimed at trying to impact the Ukrainian people, if you like, and kind of making them feel what kind of things that weren't really happening. There's multiple phishing, spear phishing campaigns targeting specific Ukrainian military and government officials. And again, a lot of websites suddenly appeared pretending to be support of Ukraine. And a lot of these sites that in defiance of Ukraine. These were actually set up by Russia as a means to collect credentials and to collect money. So it was kind of all of a big ruse and a plan. We've sort of seen a big disinformation campaigns, and we've seen this quite substantially. As an area of influence that we're really seeing quite substantially. We're going to kind of see this again from nation-state actors, of how they utilize disinformation campaigns at scale to turn people on or off to a specific subject. So they're targeting the Russian people in particular, they're targeting the Ukrainian people, and they're also trying to target Western countries as well, to try and turn them off to Ukraine, and so people will support Russia. So this is a really big area of focus in terms of disinformation. I talked about already some of the attacks that were on critical infrastructure. But multiple DDoS attacks. They tried to take out their comms, they tried to take out their internet as quickly as possible. And that was all designed to cripple them, really. But I think the interesting thing then is Ukraine itself put out a plea to please all attackers go on the offensive against Russia. Now, the interesting thing, and I talked about the type of threat actors that we are actively tracking, we do not track anonymous. Reason why: anybody can pretend to be anonymous. So if you can pretend that you're launching this attack, you're defending Ukraine, you're defending Russia, you're defending whoever in the name of anonymous. But actual fact, you said anybody can pretend to be anonymous. And it almost kind of allows them to go unnoticed for longer because they have this kind of hacktivism, they kind of have this thing behind them that suggests that they have legitimate reasons for why they're doing these attacks. So kind of what do we learn from this? What are kind of some of the actionable insights? Well, it really does start with the foundations, and we will kind of say this till the cows come home, but over 98% of attacks can still be avoided with some really simple things. And kind of right in the middle, we talk about MFA. And we talk about MFA 100% of the time for 100% of users. The reality is only 26% of companies actually have MFA enabled. So when you're thinking about M365, you're thinking about Azure, you're thinking about Windows, MFA is built in. Now we have had this kind of argument to say, should Microsoft not just enable it by default and just turn it on? But there are some camps that say, please do not just turn it on. We need to make sure that we are under control, we're doing all of those things. If MFA had been enabled, no MFA in particular, 27 times higher compromise without MFA. So you're thinking about that initial access, those password sprays, they're protecting the admins, protecting the users, MFA really does work, really does make a difference. The two things either side is about privilege, the principle of least privilege, and also keeping versions up to date. Now this sounds like patching. Again, it's Microsoft. All we do is say patch Tuesday, patch your systems. It is absolutely critical. Time is of the essence. When we release a patch, the attackers know they only have a finite window before the patch is applied, before they can get in your network and do what they need to do. Chances are they're already in before you've made the patch if you haven't patched quickly enough. So patching is really critical, principle of least privilege. Making sure that you're utilizing anti-malware. Now we have seen some companies that have said we have anti-malware installed on our endpoints. Not very helpful if you're not actually keeping it up to date. So just having anti-malware, antivirus, whatever installed only does a part of the job. Particularly when I talked about at the beginning, the amount of detections and the amount of things that we're blocking. If you don't have those detections enabled, you're going to be having a lot of attacks still coming through into those environments. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is really around just how do you defend against some of these type of attacks. Now we talked about stolen passwords. How do you defend against some of those things? Well, I'm going to have to say it's MFA again. But as I said before, not all MFA is the same. So we want biometric authentication. Where we can't do that, we want FIDO, we want a token, we want some kind of physical interaction with that user and that device. Now this is a really important area, I have to say, for frontline workers, people working in manufacturing, people who don't work on laptops, who have IoT devices, multiple different devices, shared devices. So we want to give them some kind of token. We want to give them something to authenticate against. So there has to be, as I say, some kind of physical interaction to authenticate with. Do not rely on a password alone. So the second kind of thing is missing or disable security products. Now one of the things I talked about is what we'd observed in ransomware with misconfigurations. And this really comes down to how you're building resources. Now Microsoft has security benchmarks, we have best practices, we can tell you how to build a resource out of the box with the right security controls, with the right policies. Now you still have to define those policies up and down, but if you're not managing the admins or how they're configured, this allows the attacker to gain access, to make changes, to delete resources, to delete backups. And if no one's actually monitoring those, then you can kind of see how they can just sit in your environment, they can do all the things, they can emulate an admin without too much issues. So actually we need to make sure that those policies are in, they're configured, they're monitored, and making sure that all changes into the environment are also authenticated. So it's often asked, how does Microsoft protect Microsoft? We do not have open-ended access. We have just in time in just enough. So if it only takes 5 minutes to make an update or make a change, you only get 5 minutes and then it's shut off. So we're taking all of these different controls, different actions to make sure that we're protecting the environment as much as possible. The next thing is with the misconfigurations, again, comes down to a lot of legacy applications that we see in the environment probably still have very old passwords attached to them. Maybe they don't even have a password. Maybe they're so old, people forgot about them, and these just enable more backdoor access. Particularly if that password is admin, password 123, all of these things. If you're not utilizing applications in your environment, if they're dormant, haven't been utilized, get rid of them, turn them off, make sure they're not enabled, make sure you can't get access to them from the internet or from the outside world. And the next core area is, as I talked about, slow patching. And I know it sounds a bane of people's lives. No one likes to patch. It's, as soon as you get a patch come out, an emergency patch, you've got to test it, you've got to apply it, you've got to do all of these things. But actually, it's really, really critical. And it's not just your infrastructure, it's patching and making sure that you're also on top of your software as well, particularly if you're utilizing open source software. Now, obviously Microsoft also owns GitHub, and we have huge array of developers. I think it's over 70 million people at the moment utilizing GitHub, open source software, different types of software. If you don't know where that software is being utilized, if you don't have an inventory, when you have something like Log4j or some other kind of compromise, it's going to take you a very, very long time to understand where that software is being utilized, what's the impact, and therefore you need to make sure that you're keeping track and prioritizing all of those software updates as well as the infrastructure. So I want to just round out with some strategic needs and strategic areas, really. And there's 5 paradigm shifts that we're sort of seeing and things that we've talked about. So we talked about digital empathy, and that's really about understanding the people. Now, it's very easy for us to just sit there and blame the user when they click a link, they've given out their credentials, they've done all these things. And we do our 30 minutes of e-learning, expect people to be secure. We can't train people to be secure because of the amount of change which is happening and the scale of change. So what we need is the technology to be a safety guard. We need to preempt that they are going to click, they're going to give their credentials away, they're going to do all of this stuff, and therefore the technology needs to be built and designed to counteract that. Zero trust sounds like a buzzword, but from Microsoft's perspective, it's really, really core. And identity is central to all of this. Now, as we saw, identity is a prime target for attackers. I talked about the threat intelligence, and it's not just the volume of intelligence, it's the diversity of the feeds, where those feeds are coming from, the context, what it's telling you, what you can insight, but it has to be actionable. You have to be able to do something with this. And it needs to tell a story. So if the attacker, how did the attacker get in? When did they get in? What changes did they make? Did they exfiltrate data? Are they still in my network? Hence the reason why you need the extended detection and response capability. And we talk about resilience, but from a cyber perspective, and really when it really hits the fan in your crisis management, we cannot have a cyber response without a business response. But we need the business to understand the impact, the real business impact, particularly when we're talking about critical infrastructure, how they can infiltrate the IT, the OT, and those type of areas. And we need a real deeper focus on that harmonization across ecosystems. So that's the IT, the OT, and the IoT. Now I have about 10 minutes, and I'm going to just round out where Microsoft is going. So I've talked about all the things that you can do, and you can do that right now, and it's not dependent on Microsoft. So you've already hopefully invested in a lot of Microsoft technologies, you'll invested in other technologies, but actually it's the principles that's really important. So where is our focus? What is important? Well, I said already, identity is absolutely core, it's absolutely critical. And it's why Coach has dedicated an entire day to identity tomorrow. And there are a couple of workshops there that you might want to attend. But it's this identity protection at all levels. So it's not just about the people, it's any device. And actually we're trying to protect any access into your environment. Your identity is the root of all trust, in terms of not just getting access into your environment, but what happens next, how much access, how much trust, and what can they do with that, how long is it going to take before you notice. And that social engineering protection is really key. So if we know that people the attackers are actively targeting the people themselves, if they're trying to spam an MFA bypass, things that we should ask ourselves is, why are you even getting an MFA request when you're already on the network? You've already authenticated. So if you're getting a request on your mobile phone that's telling you to authenticate, we really need to be questioning that, and we need the technology itself to be able to identify that. Now, I talked already about this kind of quandary, if you like, with regards to, does Microsoft just enable the controls by default? Now, some say yes, some say no. So it's a difficult thing because we are a commercial enterprise, as we sort of said, and customers have to be mindful of their own policies and processes. We can't unilaterally just put out updates without that being tested, without customers understanding the impact of a lot of those things. So what we are designing is security-enabled defaults. So rather than you having just something out of the box that you then have to configure, manage, put policies on yourself, what we're looking to do is actually have those baselines already there that enables you to be, at least enable some level of protection out of the box right from day one. Now, you still then have to be able to configure things up and down as against your own policies and processes. Kind of the second area is threat protection. It's kind of one of the things that we talked about in terms of extended detection and response. We've got customers, as much as we talk about the cloud, the reality is they're running hybrid. Going to be running hybrid for a long time. So you're on-premise, you've got cloud, you've got multi-cloud, hundreds of applications, hundreds of services. And so from Microsoft's perspective is to protect all of those platforms together. And we want to drive deeper insights in terms of that threat intelligence and put the machines to work. And we're talking about hyperscale intelligence. And it's really getting deep into the environment in terms of driving those insights and where they're coming from. And a lot of this is about reducing the complexity. So we talk about all of those resources, all of those endpoints that are being added to the environment every single minute. So how do you keep sense? How do you get all of those things together? And so automation and orchestration is really, really core to that. One of the things that we're focusing on, particularly with Sentinel, particularly with threat hunting, is how do you actually enable people to do that without having the skills. So we know there's a massive skills gap, so we can't just wait for more analysts, more people to join the company and wait however long it's going to take to train them. We need those people to be actively enabled and be able to detect their intelligence right from day one. So one of the things that we're focusing on in particular is when you query the data, when you get lots of logs, how does someone interpret a log when there's hundreds of them, thousands of them? And so what we're looking to do is make this as simple as possible, literally clear text. Ask a question, get a question back in plain English without you actually having to know coding language and all of the other types of language that you need. And kind of the final area is about the data. So what are the attackers after ultimately? They're after data. And it's information protection is really core. So we have to protect the people, we have to protect the data, but we need to drive insights on that data. Where is my data? Who's got access to it? How's it being exfiltrated out of the company? And we need to correlate behavior. So as much as we talked about the external threat, we also need to be cognizant of the internal threat as well, particularly from social engineering and those type of people. Again, why would I waste my time breaking into your network trying to exfiltrate data when I can go directly to source? If that person is going to give me the data and willingly give up highly sensitive information, I need to know that. I need to correlate that across all of those platforms. And I need to take dynamic action no matter where it is and what's going on. And if it is an insider threat, then I also need to be mindful about how I look at investigations, how I do forensics, how I then give that to law enforcement as well. So it's a huge area of focus from Microsoft, is to bring all of that together into one platform, ideally, and one pane of glass. That's a kind of the utopia. We're not there yet, but that's kind of the vision when we're talking about reducing the complexity.